thanks for having me. And I should say that I'm here mostly because of Michelle Rich, who I know has been lured away by the bright lights of LA. And I first met Michelle when I was living in Marfa, Texas, and she was living in Alpine, Texas, quite close to this site here. So I'm going to show some pretty pictures from some of the areas where I've worked over the last 15 years. I should also say from the start that I'm very aware of I'm very interested in the historiography of rock art research. I suppose that's what got me interested in rock art around the world, how it's been approached by archaeologists, by anthropologists and by art historians around the world. It seems to have a very different trajectory in different countries. And I did most of my education was in England, which is where I'm from, originally the English system. But my first academic job was in Johannesburg at the Rock Art Research Institute. And some of you may have heard of Professor David Lewis-Williams, who wrote a fantastic book called Mind in the Cave, that really, for the first time, set this out about why rock art had been marginalised for so long by so many people, not just people who love digging in the ground, and I love doing that. I should say now that I know very little about it. I'm sort of the token guy who's asked to help occasionally, but I specifically go out to rock art sites, so this is what I specialise in, and of course I'm looking at a holistic approach with a group of people who are much more qualified at that. But the David Lewis-Williams book was such an interesting read, and it's controversial, like most good books that have made a change in in any subdiscipline, in that he used ethnography, and of course we've got to use ethnography judiciously. There could be nothing more obvious when we're trying to get at the slippery concept of meaning of rock art. But he also was explicit about why he was using this ethnography from various hunter-gatherer cultures around the world and using it to try and explain some of the images in the caves of Europe. And of course, it's very hard to define who the indigenous people are of Europe. Who do we speak to today? That again is an interesting point, because people for decades, centuries perhaps, conveniently forgot about the Sami people living in the north of Europe. They can tell us a lot about the rock art. But I suppose this brings me to this idea of identity and the fact that rock art can be and is used as this vehicle for contested identity, which was in my title of the blurb here. The word contested isn't there, but I would argue that whenever we're talking about identity, it's going to be contested in some way. You know, who's defining this? And my current project is specifically about how rock art is presented to the public, and I'm very interested in how people are receiving rock art, because a lot depends on the message that the stakeholders, whether they're indigenous or non-indigenous, what kind of message are they putting across. And no one's really done big surveys of visitor books, and of course this gets political as well. But so I'll show you some slides, because I'm going to argue that it's without knowing something about the meaning of the rock art, or at least attempting to get at it, which is what I find interesting about rock art. Of course, we could just classify and describe forever. But then the question is, at what point do we think we've got enough data to start putting forward interesting ideas? I think it's a lot more fun. Of course, one is going to be shot down for proposing stuff unless you've backed it up carefully, but we've got ideas, we can talk to indigenous descendants, and then therefore we can present the rock art in a meaningful way. So that's why my background work on regionalism and identity and meaning in the past can play into stuff in today's world and in terms of indigenous groups today. So I'm going to look at this triangulation between material, culture, people and identity, because to me that's what archaeology is. We can't allow the people to be edited out of that triangulation. And the more recent issues, which I'll just show you towards the end, about exactly who delivers the past. And this is the heritage stuff. This is why I'm at Stanford at the moment, because they've had a big push recently towards heritage. I'm going to look at some case studies. A lot of them happen to be in national parks, which in itself I think is an interesting idea when we look at identity, because these are national parks run by government, and the interplay with tourism, this idea of rather simplistic binary opposition between nature and culture, the multivocality, of course, whose voice are we listening to? I'm just going to give you one Australian case study, because otherwise I'll talk too long, and a few shots from West Texas, India and South Africa. And then the last 10 slides of my sort of 50 or so I'll have to go quickly through some of them, is about this recontextualization. It's sort of the second part of my project, when we've got rock art images that are in new context. You're probably used to seeing them in commercial context on wine bottles and on mouse pads and on t-shirts. There's some serious issues there about intellectual property and commercialization. We find them in national symbols, in new artistic context, also in academic context. And I suppose my key point is that the rock art can be potent both on and off the rocks. Perceptions of rock art studies, and I actually know these two cartoonists from the Guardian newspaper, they were keen to get away from this notion that rock art is nothing more than either pretty pictures, because these were made by noble savages or simpletons who had nothing better to do than sort of idle doodles, or representing a menu of what these people like to eat. We know from 100 years of rock art research that rock art is much more important than that. It took me a while at first to notice the guy there with the brown bag, and so this did make me chuckle, but here's the sort of first fast food menu. And rock art appears in all of these cartoons, and that's also what I'm looking at, because it's very visual, it's amusing. This is sort of a classic statement that's used in Australia all the time, and this is about heritage in general, and this can be applied across the world, and I'll let you look at that. But this is just setting the scene for the Australian context where I've been working recently. I can say as well, it's without doubt the most politically charged environment that I've ever worked. This lovely billabong here, for example, in Kakadu National Park near Darwin, is actually a filled-in uranium tailing mine. So it's there's more to this than meets the eye. It'll be a rock, well worth visiting. It's in Kakadu National Park, and after seeing some rock art, tourists are taken here and given a glass of wine, and you look out over the landscape. These are some of the images you find in Kakadu. That hand there has actually been used successfully in a land claim case to show that this particular group, the Gunjetli, have been living here for 40,000 years. It's probably about 1 metre across, so 3 feet across, that one on the top right. We've got contact art here, the rifle and the man. Often in rock art you see it in this continent. European settlers are depicted with this aggressive sort of hands on hips posture, smoking a pipe. 7 layers of paint here, it's very hard to make out, and I've really got a convenient pointer, but there's an interesting ceramic mug there. And another reason that rock art has been overlooked for so long, quite understandably, is that it's so hard to date. How do we put it into the time-space grid? We know where it is, because unlike a lot of archaeological artefacts, it hasn't moved around so much, so that's nice. But as you all know, when it comes to dating rock art, it's very, very difficult. But I would also argue that that isn't necessarily a problem. There are still interesting questions we can ask. When we do find items of introduced material culture, like this European ceramic mug, we can get a nice date on it. And these are some of the sites that are open to the public in Kakadu. And again, there's rich ethnography about this particular site. The Gunjetli people have been living in this area for 40,000 years. But until recently, the sign that was at this site really did just say these are just pretty pictures. People had nothing else to do. I'm not going to go into the actual mythology because it's deeply layered. I'll talk a bit more about it shortly. But this is the Lightning Brothers guy who, interestingly for me in terms of regionalism, is found over vast areas of Australia. So again, when people say we can't overgeneralise, of course we can't overgeneralise, but there are some parallels. Half man, half beast, for example, which you find in rock art all over the world. There is some interesting questions there about why are we getting these widespread traits. A close-up of Navalwinjbul Winj, which took me a long time to learn how to say, but I quite enjoy saying it now. This is an interesting site because, as some of you might know from the Australian rock art, there's still this debate about some indigenous groups want to and do repaint their images, much to the horror of, certainly 30 years ago, the horror of conservators, because they believe that these are living beings. So here's again, it's questioning our ideas of categories, and they need to be retouched, repainted to ensure the healthy country, the health of the countryside. Similarly, other groups say these should be allowed to disappear and fade away. It's a natural life cycle. And you get this here with Native American groups as well. For a long time, conservators would say, maybe arguing that this was universal heritage, but we had to do everything we could to try and preserve it. And heaven forbid anyone would go and touch up this paint. So again, this comes into issues of conservation and how we present it to the public. I'm going to skip through that, and I apologise, I'm going to have to do that a few times because I'm going on too much already. But ultimately, again, I suppose I've never seen myself as a particularly political person, but when you're working with groups at a site like this, which is repainted perhaps every 5-10 years, this is a great guy called Jimmy Wok Wok, and a lot of tourists ask, you know, how come you've got this plastic water bottle? It's this whole thing again about indigenous cultures existing today. They're not just relics of the past, and I think rock art can be used very powerfully for that as an enfranchising mechanism. And again, this has helped with various land claims. This is a great film recently. I highly recommend it. It's in Jailin country, and this woman here called Margaret hadn't seen this site for 70 years because it's part of a national park. There's mining nearby. So again, it's about access to sites, and it's spectacular. This site. I'll have to check the name of the film. I've just forgotten it. I've got it written down somewhere. But it's in Jailin country, Jawoyn, and it's this whole cave ceiling is covered with paint, and these pillars have been modified by Aboriginal folk over 40,000 years. I'm going to apologise and skip this one. It's the other Australian case study, and I want to get on to some Texas stuff, and so I'll probably spend 5 minutes on this and then 5 minutes in South Africa. So I was living in Marfa, Texas, where the famous Marfa lights are. It's also full of hipsters from Austin. Donald Judd, the modern artist, moved down there in the 60s. For those of you who haven't been, it's terrific. I gave a talk in the wonderful bookstore in Marfa, and I followed someone who was talking about Donald Judd, who I admire as an artist, but Donald Judd was known as the first site-specific artist. He put up these aluminum cubes in the fields, and then I turned up and said, actually, there's some other, a bit annoyingly, but there's some other more site-specific art in this area that's been here for at least 4,000 years, possibly 10,000, and that's the rock art, which is very little known. We know a lot about the Lower Pecos stuff. A lot of archaeologists and anthropologists have worked there. We know a lot about the Jornada stuff, but no one had really looked at stuff in between. So when I was living in Austin, Texas, I was invited out to Sul Ross State University in Alpine, which is where I met Michelle, to look at some of this rock art, and this was what I worked on for my PhD thesis. And again, you know, this is the sort of classic map from the handbook, and this is about the question of where do we go to for ethnography? You know, who were the indigenous people of West Texas? You know, we know a lot about the Tarahumara today. You know, here's Texas here. The Humano, this sort of famously elusive group, and they're relative newcomers as well. But who was there before? No one really knows. So I'll just touch on it today a bit, but it makes it that much harder when it comes to presenting the rock art. How do you say something interesting about it? And I think ethnographic analogy is, of course, it's fraught with danger, but it's better than saying we don't know anything about it. I made the mistake of watching this film a week before going out to Marfa. And again, it's this classic idea of the wilderness. This was the wilderness, but of course it was also someone's homeland, and I was always worried about meeting this chap on the road. The first victim, actually, of Javier Bardem was the bank manager of Marfa, who was playing the cop in this car. He was a hilarious guy. So yeah, it was a fascinating place. And it's in between these two areas that I mentioned. To the west is the famous site of Hueco Tanks, where we've got all these different groups, and certainly there are affiliations with Hueco Tanks for all of these groups. And then to the north, which I didn't mention on the map, you've got these Jornada sites as well, Three Rivers, fantastic. Some of you who worked in Nevada might recognise sort of bighorn sheep, and again, this is more than just a bighorn sheep being killed because it was good to eat. I'll go on to that in a minute. But this is the stuff in West Texas that had been recorded by someone who worked in the art history department at Sul Ross in the 80s, but no one else had done anything with it, which fascinated me. And I think it was partly because it was very hard to get to, also because it's not as aesthetically, in inverted commas, as stunning as the stuff to the west at Hueco Tanks, the Jornada region, or to the east of Lower Pecos. And these sort of bizarre, I mean, this hasn't been altered by Photoshop or equivalent program, but these bizarre human figures, I think this is deliberate smearing. I found that in many places. something to do with an engagement with the rock surface, and there's good ethnography there on the veil between this world and the next world being important. It's not just because people couldn't depict stuff realistically, because there are depictions of very finely rendered stuff, like this deer, which is 6 feet across, possibly in a position of death. When again, you find this in many parts of the world. You can observe it in the natural world, so here is a reflection in some sense of what's going on in the natural world, but again, there's more to it. The head lolling, lots of handprints, and these figures that appear to be, again, this is, I'm going to immediately say this is conjecture in this part of the world, but images that almost appear as though they're coming through the rock face. And I say I'm using conjecture because of the ethnography in other regions. These aren't just hollow outline figures because people couldn't be bothered filling in the paint. We can talk about that later. Skip that one. Lots of newly discovered sites in Big Bend National Park, and this is what partly got me into the idea of how a site's presented, because it seems to me that in this country where I've worked before, I should also say I'm half American, so I feel I can say these things, but there's this site secrecy policy, and yes, stuff gets vandalised, but this country more than anywhere else has got this idea, I think, that if we don't tell anyone where these sites are, then they won't get vandalised. But unfortunately they do. A few idiots are always going to find them. So this got me to thinking about how sites are presented in places like Australia and the northern neighbours, Canada, where I was just last week, about this idea of inculcating sites with a sense of value, putting up signboards saying this was important to the indigenous people here for these reasons, and people will treat the site with respect. It's not going to stop graffiti completely. So Big Bend National Park, there's only one site officially open to the public in the whole of the park. And the other ones, maybe a dozen of the other ones have been vandalised, the secret ones, and then some of them are so remote that you probably don't have to worry too much about it. But this was a spectacular find. It was just a week before I got there. 275 cupules on this boulder. Again, not just for utilitarian purposes. Why would you need so many? Quite a few of them on the vertical surfaces. And there's actually 6 vulva symbols, or again, how do we classify those? That's another contentious issue, but the 3 here seem fairly unambiguous. Also, these are amazing, and these they're going to be released next year. And the guy who found these will be famous because everyone knows about the medicine wheels up in the north of the United States, but there's actually there's a few tantalising petroforms as far south as Big Bend. I know there's some good ones in eastern California and in Nevada as well, but there's a lot of these turtle effigies. And we know a lot about the importance of turtles in the Native American mythology. So again, just keep your eye out for that if you're interested in your rock alignments or your petroforms. I'm deliberately going fast because I want to just give you a few images from each of these different countries. But this is from the slide on my first slide at Myers Springs, and this got me thinking about regionalism and identity because it's at the far west of the famous Lower Pecos area. It doesn't really fit the ideas of the famous Lower Pecos stuff, these large anthropomorphs, often with their arms spread and big hands and a bird sitting on top. People like Solvik Turpin and Carolyn Boyd have, I think, compellingly argued that these have got something to do with shamanism, and that's, again, rock art researchers sometimes can't stand that word, so we call them ritual specialists, if you will. Something going on about spirit animals, vision quests. But we're also finding them into this, the Trans-Pecos area where I was working, and this is a sort of borderline site, if you will. It's a boundary, which I always find interesting because we're getting away from the heartland of a region. And it's also, of course, the waters are muddied, which I think could be interesting, by the arrival of different groups, these plains groups, the Apache and the Comanche. And again, when we talk about regionalism and the time-space grid, we tend to draw lines around maps. forgetting that we're actually talking about one specific moment in time. Of course, there were indigenous groups here before the Apache and the Comanche arrived. And it was also interesting, I think, that the Apache and Comanche arrived at about the same time as the Spanish do as well. But this got me thinking not just about regional identity, but the commodification of images like the Thunderbird. Perhaps after Kokopelli, or the flute player, the Thunderbird is found in more new context, on more T-shirts and tattoos than anything else. Similarly, the sun symbol, which of course is on the New Mexico flag. Yeah, wonderful images of clear priests. It's a bit more complicated stuff like this. We know about the Apache Gaan dances from the ethnography. So again, it's sort of, these weren't just reflections of what was out there. There's some deep symbolism here going on, even in the contact art. Okay, so this really will be skipping through India very quickly. For 2 field seasons here in south central India, working with a team from Cambridge who were interested in the whole out of Africa hypothesis. This is Mike Petroglia's work. He's now at Oxford. He's from Wisconsin originally. He's from the northern states anyway, and he's done some amazing work about possible routes out of Africa. So I was the sort of token rock art person to come and look at these daubings, and we had some interesting chats about that. But India is fascinating because there are so few skeletons found, even bones. So it was mostly about microliths and the Toba volcano, the super eruption 74,000 years ago. But this again brought home ideas of identity for me, because there are Hindu pilgrims that go up and down this valley between 2 Hindu temples all the time, and they add their Shiva and Vishnu symbols on top of the ancient rock art. And again, who's to say that they can or can't do that? This is a spectacular 15th century Hindu temple. Again, I mean, this was incredibly remote, not the most aesthetically stunning or easy to decipher rock art. But the issue here was that a lot of the Indian anthropologists simply refused to talk to the tribal peoples because of it's hard to talk about this, but it's the caste system meant that it's similar in many parts of the world, where it's the same idea of why should we talk to these people who have lived here for 1,000 years about the importance of the rock art. Of course the meanings have changed, but for people who say that we're not going to learn anything from any of the indigenous groups, it's I think quite frankly there's still some rather benevolent paternalistic notions going on there. Just a few of the weird and bizarre images in India. This was the site where thousands of microliths were found, and above and below the ash from the Toba volcano. This is a long way from Toba in Indonesia. So that was very exciting. Rock art was very hard to see, but there were quite a few nice half man, half elephant figures. Again, that immediately to me says this is more than simple doodles or depicting what was out there, something more important going on. A lot of the images seem to be deliberately placed in areas where water would run down. And again, we need some hard figures on this, but this ties in with the idea of these images being perhaps beings in themselves, and you see it in the caves in France, for example. Why were people painting in places where they knew that the water would run? I'll leave that one hanging. These are the Hindu and the Shiva and Vishnu symbols, sometimes hundreds of them. And again, to me that's interesting when we look around the world and look at the places where there's sort of unequivocal ethnography, like Southern Africa, for example, when we have later groups of people deliberately painting over earlier groups' art, and people have dismissed it in the past as saying this is just vandalism, there's no respect, but in fact we know from ethnography that there's this real sense of drawing power from the stuff underneath. They were aware of the spiritual significance of the site, and this is what the sadhus, the Hindu pilgrims, argue today. And then much more modern art, there's sort of comedy token beard. But the Om symbol and this sort of variation of an ancient, I thought it was an ancient English game called Nine Men's Morris, but it's been around a lot longer in India, and very few archaeologists that I spoke to in England actually knew about that. It's a bit like the bow game you get in Africa. And then again, local Hindu shrines to Gangama, the goddess. We do have some undeniably secular art. This was painted here as a scarecrow to keep the birds away from the ground nuts that were being grown here. Okay, 5 minutes on South Africa. Yeah, sorry, I've packed quite a lot into this, but I'd really like to hear ideas, especially about the contested identity part and the symbols in rock art symbols in new contexts. It's a different response to it everywhere I go. And this was the first ethnographic work and first field work I did was in southern Africa, and I was spoiled in the sense that we have so much ethnography from the Bushmen, the San people. There's 14,000 pages of verbatim text written down by a German linguist in the 1870s. From this group here, the Clan. Nelson Mandela's group, the Xhosa, one of the 11 officially recognised groups in Africa today, South Africa today, the 11 official languages, comes from a group of people that borrowed a lot from the Bushman orthography. So that's why you get these clicks in certain Southern African languages. The other body of ethnography we've got is early anthropological work done in the 50s and the 60s, the Marshall family, from an area quite a long way north in the Kalahari Desert. This is where the Bushmen still live today. And what's mind-blowing is the similarity between the ethnography from this group, who are now not extinct because of the intermarriage with other South African groups, but very little is known about the old Bushman groups, if you like. But the parallels between their ethnography and the modern anthropological work in the Kalahari today. I'm going to skip this with Blombos. I'll just point out that this is, some people say this isn't art, but there's deliberate patterns there to these geometrics, and you might have seen this in the news as well. It's been put forward that this is the oldest art in the world, and this is from a site near Cape Town. But again, it's being used as a way of these previously marginalised people to show that they're still important in the world today. Half man, half beast. These are some of the most spectacular you'll see, and it's in terms of aesthetics again, and it's why I think partly why a lot of researchers have been drawn to them. But again, it's hard to say that this was just nice wallpaper on a cave wall. We know about the importance of the fly whisk as a status symbol in the Bushman groups today. Bees are full of potency, as is the eland antelope, and that most of the, or a large percentage of the myths of the Bushman people all over southern Africa talk about the importance of this antelope, not just because it's good to eat, but because if you harness the power, it'll take you into the spirit world, and you can control the game and bring rain and so on. Ritual specialists or shamans, when they're going into trance, bleed from the nose, and we often see these half antelope figures, antelope head bleeding, and in the trance dance or medicine dance, great dance, people sit around in a circle wearing these cloaks, which again is a status symbol, and they clap, and they hold sticks to help support themselves and fly with. So this is an example where we've got strong ethnography, and very few people will deny that today. We also get the examples of contact art, so the arrival of European guns. And then, again, this was the first visitor centre I worked on. I was just a sort of junior researcher, but I helped a bit with getting this ready, and again, this sort of got me interested in how we're presenting this rock art to the public. Because it's so remote, and because it's in South Africa, and there are, if you like, far more important problems in South Africa, this centre is now closed. It was this very emotional talk with the director of this centre, who'd been living out in this remote area for 10 years, and he couldn't believe that thousands of tourists weren't coming to see it. And it was, his whole life was caught up in this centre. But of course there are practical considerations. And it's also why I think it's important that we do full background checks as to who's going to turn up to see these sites. We forget as archaeologists that other people might not be interested in this stuff at all. Certainly in southern Africa, when you've got these amazing game reserves, you probably want to go and see lions and leopards before you want to go and see a few paintings. So this is another, we've got to be realistic about this issue. Okay, I'm going to skip those two. Again, I apologise for it being sort of rapid fire. Just the last 10 slides about trying to bring all this together and think about how it can affect people and identity today, and how we might go forward. And again, any comments I'd be very grateful for. Because this image here features rock art sort of front and centre. And again, I find it interesting because rock art was marginalised for so long in North America. If you look back at the early anthropological work of the late 1800s, it was there. The anthropologists, a lot of the most interesting research, the interpretive research, was around rock art, because here's this spectacular window into past life views and ideas. Again, of course, we've got to be cautious. But the fact that the BAE was putting it here front and centre, and of course, you could argue till the cows come home about what the purpose was of the BAE. Was it a government means of claiming this wilderness, this idea of manifest destiny, expanding westwards? And if you map the wilderness, do all this great work, it's a good way of sort of claiming it for your own. But here it is in a sort of semi-government, his rock art in a semi-government context. In a much more direct government national symbol, this is the new coat of arms for South Africa. So after the fall of apartheid, the new government obviously wasn't going to carry on with the old Afrikaner flag and coat of arms, and so there's loads of symbolism. Each of these elements making up the coat of arms obviously is highly symbolic. But interestingly, from rock art or an archaeological point of view, we've got two rock art figures, San Bushman figures, literally in the centre of this coat of arms. Unfortunately, most of the San people, most of the groups that put forward ideas about this were ignored. So it wasn't all sort of roses, but a few groups were, and it's the same old story, and who do we listen to? And it certainly raised the profile of rock art in South Africa. There's actually just one figure in the cave near Cape Town where this image was taken from, so they duplicated it, flipped him round, so it sort of almost looks like they're sort of high-fiving each other, or sort of greeting each other in friendship. The image in the cave itself was certainly male, so here, this guy here has been neutered, so it doesn't offend anyone. We know from ethnography about the importance of these white bands. It's to do with shamanistic status as well. Just throwing that in there to say again, I mean, just because something looks obvious, symbols that look obvious can often be extremely deep and resonate on many levels. The motto, which is in this extinct clan language, means people who are different come together. And David Lewis Williams, the professor I mentioned earlier who wrote The Mind in the Cave, was actually asked to help come up with this motto because it's in this extinct language. And he's got a mischievous sense of humour. He'd also done more than just about any academic to speak out against apartheid, but he realised that he could change just two of these symbols, and these again indicate the different cliques. And instead of people who are different come together, or strength and diversity, I'm thinking about the other motto, he could change it to mean we are all wild dogs. And would have probably changed the history of Southern Africa. But I suppose that's that idea of the role of academics. You know, people can make a difference. It's too easy to say, I'm going to leave this to other people. And that's what my point earlier about I was particularly political. But when you're thrown in the middle of it, it's people are going to contest identity in different ways, regardless of whether academics get involved. So I think when we're working with powerful stuff like this, it behooves us to speak up. Especially when we do find stuff like this. And again, I started off thinking I don't want to be too judgmental or castigate people, but it's amazing how many tattoos there are. A lot in Turkey for some reason. And this guy is so proud of his tattoo. And again, you could argue that it's harmless, it's just a bit of fun. But you know, what about when there's alcohol involved? It's good beer at this brewery. I've had some, and certainly in Southern Africa, that's still a major problem. The Bushmen, the San, the Khoisan people are still paid at the end of each fortnight for working on farms in alcohol, and we know the devastating effects of alcohol for anyone, but particularly some indigenous groups. And yeah, again, here's this thunderbird, and I won't go into there's far too much theory about does advertising and fetishization always have to be bad. I think it's a lot to do with the context and the sensitivity, and it's just common courtesy again. I think it's about who you're working with. And if this can generate money for these previously marginalised communities, then it's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, I've had more problems with this. Very proud of this motel. It's in Arizona, I think, and you get the sort of fertility symbols above the bed. But then Joe Strummer, I'm a big fan of Joe Strummer, but this just made me laugh because Joe Strummer's from Leeds in England. There aren't any mescaleros in Leeds as far as I know, and I haven't heard this album. It's impossible to get hold of now, but you know, this is the guy who's written all these great songs. There's rock art right there. Again, so I'm just working through some of these things. The casino just outside of El Paso in West Texas is a great case study. It's now closed, but run by the Tiwa people. The motif is from the nearby site of Waco Tanks, which is an amazing rock art site, but this is an Apache motif, there's no doubt about it. So again, there's this thing about who owns this? Who owns this actual site? Who owns the image, copyright? Richard Handler's famous quote about being depends on having. It's this, you know, possession and the law. Seminole Canyon, a few of you might know it. I mean, here's just a lovely modern art working. It's groups, local groups were consulted. Again, it's very hard to know who the indigenous groups are of West Texas. There is now a group calling themselves the Humano Apache that are pushing for federal recognition, and they were consulted when a sculptor from Austin was saying, can I come up with some art? Again, here's this wonderful antelope-headed human figure with a bird on a staff. You know, again, most of you are probably familiar with the spiritual significance of that. And this is just to point out that it's sort of inspired by these paintings from the site. I was surprised in Canada last week to find that the Squamish Nation, in their own cultural centre, use their own images on the toilet signs in Whistler. There's an amazing cultural centre. It's won awards, rightly so, the Squamish Lilwat Cultural Centre. Amazing rock art nearby, and it's so well done, full community consultation. So they use symbols on their toilets. Very different in Kakadu. No one spoke to the Gungjetli people, and the Gungjetli believe quite strongly that any rock art image taken out of context will strip it of all of its power. So this is particularly insensitive. I'm working closely with George Nicholas, who's up at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, because he's written some seminal articles on copyright in the past. He set up this group called iPinch, the Intellectual Property something or other cultural heritage. It's all about these collaborative projects and moving forward and genuine consultation. I've also been very interested in rock art images in sporting contexts, because these are sort of nationally endorsed, but they're everywhere. I hadn't realised it. I mean, these were famous because the Inukshuks are from far northern Canada, a long way from Vancouver. You could argue it's not really rock art, but it's been used for decades. And again, it's a step above just these were simple people painting simple things, but the idea of the sort of the savage hunter, the athletic, marvelous, wonderful sportsman. A lot of groups complained about this image for the recent World Cup. Reproductions. Just got a few more slides. You've probably heard about the replica of the famous cave of Lascaux in France. People are just beginning to look at visitor books to see if how upset people are when they find out either before or afterwards that they haven't seen the real thing. They've gone to a cave nearby that's an exact replica. It's stunning. You wouldn't know the difference. But here's this sense of authenticity. Again, any European case is interesting because we can't speak to the descendants of the original artists. On the way between Austin and West Texas, I got the fright of my life when I turned the corner and saw not just a 2/3 scale image of Stonehenge, and I've just got a paper coming out about the clone henges around the world. That's not my term, but I thought it was a good one, and where they crop up. But also the Rapa Nui, the Easter Island heads as well, in the same field. There's a good clone henge there. Again, just I'll get that off my soapbox, but again, rock art often used for a few pages in these introductory volumes to art. It's sort of a grand Whig view of history that, we'll spend 2 pages on the old stuff and then the inevitable. I mean, Picasso and Van Gogh famously said, "We've learned nothing in 20,000 years," when they saw some of the French caves, so they were aware of the amazing stuff back in the past. But I suppose this is just the relevance of rock art today. Banksy loves using rock art. I hadn't realised, one of the things I hadn't read about him was his small painted plaquette, a bit of stone that he drew a caveman pushing a shopping trolley and snuck it into the British Museum. And it was there for 3 days before anyone noticed. And there's amazing security in the British Museum, but he even had a little description of, I forget the term, Homo shopialus or something. It was about early scavengers. I'm a huge fan of his, and it's really useful when I'm trying to get undergraduates involved in rock art. So this is graffiti can resonate on many different levels as well. Academic context, and this is the last couple of slides, I promise. But of course, we're appropriating images in a way when we put. I'm sure people do it here, or any archaeologist. It's as much as I like stone tools. You'll often get a nice, pretty rock art picture to put on the front of a book to sell it or a report. Again, it's visually striking, even if it might not really be anything to do with the survey, or perhaps rock art will just be mentioned as an aside. Different ways of recording rock art. Different groups prefer it done in different ways. Cultural sensitivities. Again, just the pernicious problem is a bit of a negative note to end on, but Abbé Breuil, the famous French prehistorian who worked all over Europe and in South Africa, maybe we can make excuses because he was a man of his time, but there's a spectacular Bushman image in Namibia that he dubbed the White Lady of the Brandberg. And we now know that the White Lady is neither white nor a lady. It's a Bushman hunter, very male, again, he'd been castrated for this image. But this actually influenced the way that rock art research happened in South Africa for 40 years. And again, that's an extreme example because of Southern Africa. And very final 2 slides about how we can see rock art going into the future. Famous site in Niger, which is in the National Geographic, and Second Life sort of was around for a couple of years, and as far as I know, it died. But there was loads of rock art images here in this digital realm. You can go around with your avatars, and as well as buy stuff, you can go and look at cultural heritage. And I can't find anyone to talk to about how this amazing spiritual sacred site ended up in the digital world. And again, I'm not trying to judge, but I'm just thinking about what this might mean for the future and ownership of cultural property. So thanks for bearing with me.